In 1976, in a small town in Indiana, a man stood in his front yard and watched his new house go up board by board. He worked the line at a factory. The note was $31,000, 1,500 square feet, one paycheck, one wife, 3 kids, a 20-year mortgage at $184 a month. 11 years and 1 month later, that house was paid for, and he is still living in it today. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. He was not rich. He was not lucky. He was a working man who knew 20 things almost nobody knows anymore. 20 quiet little tricks that turned a single paycheck into a deed with his name on it. Number 14 built half the suburbs in this country, and the bank tried to bury it. Number 7 is something your grandmother probably did every Friday afternoon and never talked about. And number 1 is the reason your grandfather could retire on what would feel like nothing today. Number 20. The building and loan. Long before banks ran your life, your grandfather walked into a small storefront on Main Street where the man behind the counter knew his name, knew his wife's name, and probably knew what church he went to. That place was called a building and loan. A group of working men pooled their wages every Friday into a common pot, and each week, one of them got to draw a loan to put up a house. By 1927, there were 12,800 of these little outfits across the country, with 11 million members. Most of them were laborers, factory hands, mechanics, and housewives. Your great-grandfather did not borrow from a bank. He borrowed from his neighbors, and his neighbors borrowed from him. Number 19. The Sears Kit House. Between 1908 and 1942, you could open a catalog the size of a phone book, point at a picture, mail a check, and weeks later, a railroad boxcar would pull into your local depot with 30,000 pieces of pre-cut lumber stamped with little numbers. The cheapest model was called the Golden Rod Cottage, $146.25. Sears even loaned you the mortgage from 1911 to 1933. 70,000 families built their own homes this way. Friends came over on Saturdays, neighbors brought sandwiches. The whole street showed up like it was a barn raising. When the last shingle was nailed, the man of the house owned the roof over his children. No landlord, no bank, just him. Number 18. The GI Bill. On June 22, 1944, a man named Harry Colmery sat in a hotel room in Washington with a cocktail napkin and a pen, and he wrote out the bones of a law that would put 28 million American families into their own homes. Roosevelt signed it that same month. The deal was almost impossible to believe. A returning veteran could walk into any bank with nothing in his pocket, 0 down, 4%, 20 years to pay. The bank could not say no because the government stood behind every dollar of that loan. 80% of those loans went out without a single penny down. A boy from a coal town who had never owned anything in his life came home and bought a house, and his children grew up under a roof that nobody could take away. Number 17. Levittown. On October 1, 1947, on 4,000 acres of old potato fields out on Long Island, William Levitt opened the gates on the first mass-produced suburb in American history, 750 square feet, $7,990, $100 down, $56 a month. A factory worker making $3,800 a year could afford it without his wife having to work. They put up one house every 16 minutes. 27 steps, 36 men on a crew. By 1951, there were 17,447 Cape Cods, with 80,000 people living in them. The truth has to be told here too. Bill Levitt's contract said the homes could not be sold to anyone who was not white. About 1 million black veterans came home from the same war and were turned away at the same banks. That is part of the story. The other part is what the men who did get in were able to do with 30 years. Number 16. The fully amortized mortgage. Before 1934, a mortgage in this country was a 5-year deal. You paid interest for 5 years, and at the end, you owed the entire principal in one giant payment. If you could not come up with it, you lost the house. Then, the National Housing Act of 1934 created the FHA, and the FHA invented something almost nobody had ever seen, a loan you actually paid off. Every monthly payment chipped away at the principal, 15 years, 20 years. The 30-year version did not show up until 1948 for new construction and 1954 for older homes. That one little change took homeownership in this country from 43% to 62% in a single generation. Number 15. Sweat equity. There is a federal program called Section 502, written into the Housing Act of 1949, and another called Section 523 that let groups of low-income families build each other's houses with their own hands. 6 families on a Saturday morning swinging hammers, mixing concrete, framing walls. Each family had to put in roughly 65% of the labor themselves before they got the keys. More than 25,000 rural families have walked into a finished house knowing every nail in the wall was driven by someone they ate dinner with. There was no down payment in cash, just the skin off their hands. First pattern break. First pattern break. Notice what these first 6 tricks have in common. None of them required a college degree. None of them required Wall Street. None of them required a rich father. They required showing up, paying attention, and trusting your neighbors more than you trusted strangers. The next batch is where it gets even more personal. Number 14. The Quonset hut. After the war ended in 1945, 6 million American families were doubled up with their parents or living in tents and converted trolley cars. The country had built 170,000 of those round metal shelters during the war, and the government sold them off cheap to the men who had served. In July of 1946, in Port Hueneme, California, 811 huts went on sale, and 600 veterans showed up the first day. Los Angeles got 1,500. Castle Hill in the Bronx had 962 veteran families living in them. They were not pretty, just rounded steel and a wood floor. But for $30 a month, a young father had a roof, his wife had a kitchen, and the babies had somewhere to sleep that was not his mother-in-law's couch. Some of those families saved every dime in those huts and walked out 2 years later with a real down payment. Number 13. The USDA Rural Loan. Title V, Section 502 of the Housing Act of 1949. If you lived in the country, the federal government would lend you the money to buy a house at 1% interest with 0 down. 1%. There are still men in their 70s in West Virginia, Tennessee, and rural Iowa who paid off their houses on this program back in the 60s for less than the price of a used pickup truck. The program is still on the books today, and almost nobody talks about it. Number 12. The company town. By 1916, more than a third of all manufacturing workers in this country lived in housing built and owned by the company that paid them. Pullman in Chicago, Hershey in Pennsylvania, Kohler in Wisconsin, Roebling in New Jersey, Gary, Indiana, the entire city, built from scratch by U.S. Steel in 1906. Some of those towns were rough, some of them were beautiful. Here is the part that gets forgotten. After the courts forced these companies to sell their housing in the early 1900s, the workers who had been renting for years could buy the very house they lived in for almost nothing. A steel worker in Gary in 1955 could pick up a company-built bungalow for $2,000 in cash. He just had to be patient enough to wait for the offer. Number 11. War bonds and savings stamps. Starting on April 30th, 1941, you could buy a Series E bond for $18.75, and 10 years later, the government handed you $25 back. If $18 was too much for one paycheck, You could buy little stamps for a dime, a quarter, or 50 cents, paste them into a book, and when the book was full, you traded it in for a bond. By the end of the war, 85 million Americans owned them. The program ran until 1970. A man who bought $100 of these stamps every year from 1942 to 1955 had a fully matured pile of bonds worth $1,200 in his sock drawer when it came time for a down payment. $1,200, the price of a Levittown down payment, with money left over for the moving truck. Number 10. Christmas Club. Every Friday, your grandmother walked into the local bank with a few singles and dropped them into a special account she could not touch until December. By Thanksgiving, that envelope had grown to $80, $90, sometimes $120. Some families used it for presents. The smart ones rolled it over year after year into a separate house fund. The bank paid almost no interest. That was not the point. Money you could not touch was money you could not spend. 17 million American families ran their lives on this trick, and the bank shut it down because credit cards made them more money. Number 9. The rote billing deal. Up the river from Trenton, New Jersey, the family that built the cables for the Brooklyn Bridge built an entire town for their workers in 1904. 750 company-built houses. The Roeblings did not try to control your life like Pullman did. They gave you a roof, charged you fair rent, and when the company wound down in the 1970s, the men who had spent their lives in those houses were able to buy them for what amounted to a handshake price. The same thing happened in dozens of mill towns across the country, in Bethlehem, Homestead, and Lowell. The men who stayed long enough got to walk out as homeowners. Number 8. FHA Section 203B. This is the law that built the modern American suburb, 3.5% down, 30 years to pay, government insured. A new father with a young wife and a baby on the way could walk into a bank in 1956 with $140 in his pocket, sign his name 22 times, and drive home that same afternoon with the keys to a $4,000 bungalow on a half-acre lot. 3.5%. Read that number again. Your grandfather did it on a milkman's wages. Number 7. The land contract. This one cuts in two directions. Black families in Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland were locked out of loans insured by the FHA by federal redlining maps from 1934 all the way to 1968. 98% of loans insured by the FHA went to white families during that time. So black families found another road. Land contracts. You signed an agreement with a private seller, made monthly payments, and at the end of 15 or 20 years, you got the deed. 85% of homes sold to black families in Chicago in the 50s and 60s were bought this way. The Contract Buyers League fought back in 1968 to make it fairer. Some families lost everything. Others walked out the other side as the only homeowners on their block. The grit it took is almost impossible to describe. Number 6. The triplex. A young man in Chicago in 1950 with a wife and a baby and a $3,500 a year job could not afford a single-family house, so he bought a triplex. He lived in one apartment with his family. He rented the other two to his cousin and a coworker. The rent paid the entire mortgage. He lived in his own building free for 20 years, and at the end of it, he owned a 3-unit property outright. Census data from 1950 shows roughly 10% of urban households were doing exactly this. There is a man in the comment section of one of these videos who said his father did it on minimum wage 50 years ago. He is still alive, and he still tells the story. Second pattern break. Look at what is happening here. None of these are tricks in the modern sense. They are not loopholes. They are the everyday tools of men who understood something we have forgotten. A house is the foundation under your children's feet. The next batch is where the patience and the sweat finally pay off. Number 5. The owner-built cabin. Up in the Appalachians, out in the Ozarks, across the Pacific Northwest, Men cleared their own land, cut their own timber, and put up their own houses without ever borrowing a dollar. No code inspector, no permit, just an axe, a saw, and a wife who knew how to make supper out of nothing. A father in eastern Kentucky in 1948 could build a 4-room cabin on his own land in a single summer for under $300 in materials. He paid for everything as he went, in cash, out of his weekly wages. The floors were rough, but it was paid for the day he hung the front door. Number 4. Cash and patience. In 1950, the U.S. Census reported that 47% of every car bought in this country was paid for in straight cash. No payments, no financing, no interest. A man who saved 30 cents of every dollar for 10 years could walk into a real estate office in 1955, count out $7,300 in $20 bills, and walk out with the deed to his own home. No bank, no lien, no mortgage payment for the next 20 years. The median home cost $7,354 that year. The median household earned about $3,300, 8 years of saving 30% of his paycheck, and a man bought his house outright. Cold and simple. Number 3. The family loan. Before government programs and bank approvals, the way most young couples got their down payment was a quiet conversation across a kitchen table. The grandfather sold his bigger house, moved into a smaller one, and handed the difference to his son. The aunt who never married kept her savings in a coffee can and gave it to her favorite niece on the morning of the wedding. The brother in Ohio mailed a check to the brother in California with no paperwork, no interest, and no due date, except a handshake at the next family Christmas. Family money built more American homes than any government program ever did. Number 2. The Cooperative apartment. In 1950, the Federal Housing Administration created Section 213, which let groups of working men, often through their unions, pool their money and buy entire apartment buildings together. Each family bought a share of the corporation that owned the building, and that share entitled them to a specific apartment for life. The auto workers in Detroit did it. The garment workers in New York did it. Tens of thousands of working families became homeowners through these co-ops without ever qualifying for a single individual mortgage. Number 1. Owning it. Free and clear. Every single trick on this list pointed at one thing: the day the mortgage was paid off. Some families literally took the paid-off mortgage paper out into the backyard and burned it in a barbecue grill in front of the kids. The house was theirs, free and clear, forever. In 1960, the average American mortgage was paid off in 15 to 20 years. Today, the average mortgage stretches to 30 years, and most families refinance halfway through and start the clock over. The man in Indiana from the start of this list did not refinance. Every hour of overtime he worked, he set aside. Every extra dollar after the regular payment went straight onto the principal. 11 years and 1 month later, the house was his. He is in his 80s now. He is still in that house. His grandchildren visit on Sundays. The kitchen is the same kitchen. The roof is the same roof. The deed has his name on it and nobody else's, and nobody can ever take it away. The wood has not changed. The land is still here. We just stopped doing what our grandfathers did without thinking. Try one of them this month, just one. Then come back and tell me if your grandfather was wrong.